As we talk about faithful presence, one of the things that I've been trying to reiterate throughout this series is that the gospel is not just for the individual and where your soul goes, but the gospel is this picture of a good creation that God intended. That God, when He created the creation good, He intended for it to be good. And the focus of God throughout Scripture is not a passive God who stands in the background, but an active God who's in continual pursuit of restoring the goodness of this creation. So that has implications on the soul, but also on the body. It has implications on the different things that are going on in life. And as we look around the world, anything that is wrong in the world, we look to see what God is doing to make it right. And so as we practice the presence of God, we look for how to meet God in these moments in His presence to see what He's doing to reclaim the world. And we've been looking at the different practices that as we look at being God's presence in the world, we gather as recipients at the table to receive the presence of God, to then carry God's presence into the world, to host His presence at our tables for our neighbors to come in and experience the kingdom breaking in. And then as guests, we go into the spaces in the world around us, to the tables where we are guests, to the tables of our restaurants and our bars and our breweries and all the other places that we enter into. We go as guests with Christ's presence. And so we carry the presence with us, and we also recognize the presence of God in the world around us. And the gospel is proclaimed that God is making all things new. And 2 Corinthians chapter 5 talks about the ministry of reconciliation is this ministry of reclaiming all things and making them right and bringing them back together as God intended them in the presence of God. That's why the church is supposed to be different than the world. That the divisions between people in the world, between race and gender, between economic statuses, between all the differences that the world divides, the church breaks away those divisions and comes together as one people. What Paul calls the new humanity in Ephesians 2, that all people come together as one new humanity where the dividing walls of hostility are brought down. This is the good news. And over the last few weeks, we've been talking about the final enemy that is conquered is death. And that's the celebration of the resurrection, that death that has had its hold on the destruction of this world is being done away with so that the new kingdom, the new creation can break in. And so we live in this reality. And as we look at the different practices of attending to the presence of God in this world, over this week and the next 2 weeks, we're going to look at what does it mean to be with the least of these. And so how do we define what it means to be with the least of these? The practice of being with the least of these, this is the way in which God makes His presence known among us. He has a special place in His heart for the forgotten, the marginalized, the dejected. When we are attentive to God's presence in their lives, we commune with Christ Himself. I want to say that last line again. It says, when we are attentive to God's presence in their lives, we commune with Christ Himself. This passage in Matthew that Stephen read for us earlier is a fairly well-known passage about attending to the thirsty, the hungry, the sick, the naked, the imprisoned. And when I look at these different levels, I think about how these people are often dehumanized. That we dehumanize people who are struggling, people who are on the margins, people who are in a bad place in life. We're quick to make judgments that make them less than human. We say, okay, well, it's because of their own decisions that they are where they are. It's because of the decisions of their families that they are in the place they're in. If they would have made better decisions in their life, they wouldn't be poor. If they wouldn't, and we fill in all the blanks. Or we say, well, they came here illegally, so they are a drain on our society, so we push them off. And I'm not making political statements here. What I'm saying is if someone is struggling, they carry the very image of Christ. Is it up to us to say, do they need our help? And so when Jesus says this, he says, whatever you did for the least of these, we then say, well, if they wouldn't have done drugs their whole life, they are still carrying the image of Christ. And you can fill in the blank of all these different things that we then put in place to say, this is why they don't need help. But Jesus actually takes us, and the Christian tradition actually takes us a step beyond simply giving a hand out to people. That there's a call to being with the least of these, that sometimes what we do in our ministries is we minister to people rather than walk along with people. And the difference is this: when we see someone in need, it's really easy to say, here's some money, go be blessed. And that kind of ministry, while it is good, it doesn't reclaim the creation back to the goodness that God intended. So here's what I mean by that. Let me say that again. That when we only give a handout and we keep a distance between us and people who are struggling, those are good works, but it doesn't reclaim the goodness of creation. That the reclaiming the goodness of God's good creation is lifting people up out of their positions of poverty, lifting people up out of their hard places. And you can't do that with a handout. You have to be with them. And so to be with them is to walk alongside them, to help them figure out how to come into a better place. That the Jews had this idea called the year of Jubilee, where everything is made right, everything is balanced, and when land is taken from one group for another group, it's actually restored. And when Jesus came, the Messiah came, it was this idea of the Jubilee of Jubilees, where everything is made equal again, and there's no longer rich, there's no longer poor, but all are made one. Think back to the prayer of Mary, the song of Mary, the Magnificat. When she hears that the Messiah is going to be born through her, she sings a song that the oppressed will be lifted up and the proud will be brought down. And she sings a song of a new world where all things are made right again. She sings a song of justice. And justice is a good thing for those who are oppressed. Justice is a good thing for those who have been wronged. Justice is a good thing for people who are not being heard and listened to. And God's justice is a new way of being. But in this passage in Matthew 25, Jesus lays out, and I love the way Matthew records this, that Jesus is repeating the same thing. It says, whenever you saw someone hungry, whenever you saw someone thirsty, whenever you saw someone without clothes, whenever you saw someone, and you can keep adding to that list, whatever you did or didn't do for the least of these, you did or didn't do for me. And so what does it mean for us when we see people hurting and marginalized and struggling to not see them as the list of things that have caused them to be in that position, but to see them as holding the very face of Christ? To see them and say, oh my goodness, I have just encountered the Son of God. When I see someone marginalized, when I see someone hungry, when I see someone dejected, when I see someone in struggle, to see them as the very God in the flesh himself. When the early church read this passage, they had this idea of this is a practice that we're supposed to be about, that we're supposed to go to these people, and when we're with them, we are with Christ in a very special way. That changes relationship to where you're no longer ministering to, but you have this longing to be with. If you had the opportunity to meet Jesus, Would you simply hand him something and walk away, or would you invest in relationship? Jesus talks about this in different ways. In the Gospel of Luke, another very common, very well-known story, Luke chapter 10, verse 25, says, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And so Jesus says, what is written in the law? And how do you read it? And the expert of the law said this, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your strength, and with all of your mind. And the second is love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus says, you have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live. You will live. You will have true life. You'll find life in a whole new way if you learn to do two simple things, love God and love your neighbor. And the question then becomes, well, who exactly is my neighbor? And in reply, Jesus said this, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest, Ryan, happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side because he was too busy and had too much ministry to do. And so too, a Levite, one of the elders, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side because they were too busy tending to the church. But a Samaritan, and we hear Good Samaritans so often that we assume Samaritans are good. But you have to remember that when Jesus said a Samaritan, he means if you have a dog and a Samaritan on the road, run over the Samaritan to spare the dog. Think of the worst person, the person that makes you the most uncomfortable in this world. That's the person Jesus is bringing. That if I were to say that person, you would turn in your seat a little bit. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came to where the man was. He saw him and took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said. And when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert of the law said, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. The question began with, who is my neighbor? But Jesus turned the question into, who are you being a neighbor to? When I think about the practice of being with the least of these, we recognize Christ in the face of those who are below us. And I love there's a prayer by St. Patrick that when St. Patrick was sending his missionaries into Ireland, he prayed this prayer over them. And this is a prayer that in struggles in my life I come back to. He says, Christ before you, Christ behind you, Christ to the right of you, Christ to the left of you. Christ on the ear of every person you speak to, Christ on the lips of everyone who speaks of you. And he goes on and on and on down a list of, may you be surrounded with Christ, see Christ in every person, and be seen as Christ to every person. That when we're called to see the people who are below us as we see them as below us, we are to see Christ in them. In the same way as the people that we see above us, that we can often demonize to bring them down, we see Christ in them. And when we see people to our right and people to our left, we see Christ in them. That wherever we look, we are attentive to the presence of Christ in each and every person we meet. So that as we attend to the presence of Christ, we recognize Christ more fully in the world around us. And when we have the practice of opening our eyes to who Christ is in each person we meet, we come to know Christ more fully. And we're more attentive to what God is doing in the world through their lives. What Jesus calls us to in Luke 10 is, how are you being neighbor to others? If we're called to love God with all that we are and love our neighbors ourselves, we're also called to be neighborly to others, even the people who don't show love to us. So the practice of being with the least of these is to engage in life in a way that you're building relationships with people who don't benefit you. Jesus talks about this in a whole host of other places, but when we talk about building relationships with people that have no benefit to you, is you're loving people who you get nothing in return from, sheerly for the fact of loving them as Christ loved them. To not look at the cost-benefit analysis of what a relationship with those below us looks like, but simply attending to the presence of Christ in their lives. How would your life look differently if you ask the question, how will I know Christ better through this relationship? And when you enter into relationships with others, you're attentive to who Christ is in them, and you come to know Christ more fully. We have a unique opportunity. One of the things when I think about a new creation and a new world, I think we need artists to step forward. We need musicians to write new songs. We need painters to paint pictures that capture the imagination of what a good world could look like. When we look at a new creation, we need not only artists to inspire us, but we need the church to rise up and to show the world what a new creation could look like, what it means to be attentive to the least of these. I want to invite my friend Elizabeth up to tell us a little bit about her art piece that she's working on and that she wants us to be a part of. And after she does this, I'm going to finish up our time in the sermon to look at how we can do this as a church, to be with the least of these in this world.
Here? Is that okay? Tell me if I don't never do give the mic, so let me know if I can't hear me. Okay. We good? Here? Oh, hey, good morning. Thank you for the welcome. I'm a visual artist. I am not a public speaker, so I feel a little nervous with all of you looking at me. I believe in transparency. But I'm Elizabeth Palmisano, and I'm a local artist here in Charlotte, and I am working on what will actually be Charlotte's biggest public art piece. And it's on a new apartment building's parking deck right down the light rail. So if you're familiar with 36th Street Station, right across from 36th Street Station, there's this big, ugly, empty parking deck that desperately needs some art. We're going to take care of that, myself and a team of artists. But I'm a community artist, so all of the art that I create is in collaboration with community. And I'm also what I call a wish keeper. So folks share their wishes with me, and I transform those wishes into art. So I read each wish and kind of bring it into my heart and think about it, meditate on it, and then I create artwork that represents it. So for this project, I'm asking the community, the greater community, but most specifically people who love NODA, people who live here, worship here, work here, play here, people who have a connection to NODA. What is your wish for yourself or for someone you love, for the community, It can be anything you like. Wishes are completely anonymous. And what I'm going to do is I am going to read each and every one of those wishes multiple times, and that will inspire the visual art I'm creating. And then also all of the wishes are going to be inscribed on site as part of this permanent public installation. And I feel like it's a really big deal for us because, well, not to speak for other people, to speak for myself as a longtime Charlottean, a lot of things change in our communities and we have no say-so over them, and no one asks us what we think, and our voice is not included. And that does cross all of the things that you were talking about, no matter like our race, our gender, our socioeconomic status, doesn't matter. Things happen in our community and we have very little say-so. And I feel like that, especially for NODA. So this is my effort to put that just a little bit right, if that makes sense. And I just wanted to share with you one thing, if that's okay. Art, I think art is a powerful unifier, just like faith is, and just like love is, and unfortunately, just like tragedy is. Those are things that also cut across our differences. But this is from a book on art, and it says, giving each person a voice is what builds community and makes art socially responsive. Interaction becomes the medium of expression, an empathetic way of seeing through another's eyes. The work becomes a metaphor for relationship, which has a healing power. When there is no quick fix for some of our most pressing societal problems, there may be only our ability to witness and feel the reality taking place around us. This feelingness is a service that artists offer to the world, and you as a collaborator will also be offering to the world. So I've received wishes from children wanting to make a handstand, be able to do a handstand, from someone wishing to give birth to a live baby and to hold on to a pregnancy. I've received wishes from people for their children, for a bright future. It really can be anything you like. And you can write them on your slip and put them in this box, or there's also a box out by the chapel if you need longer to think about it. And I'm also collecting wishes digitally through my website and social media, which is, well, I don't want to stand up here and give my social information, but if you want to know how to submit digitally, I'll be happy to share. And I think that's it. So thank you so much for your time, and you're welcome.
I dropped my mic pack, so I think I busted it. I will get your information and I'll send it out to everyone so they can submit digitally. But what we want to ask you to do is, as we prepare for communion, as we prepare for dwelling in God's word and breaking bread together, to be imagining a world that God is Lord. As we profess as Christians that Christ is Lord means that the world as it is in this state is not how God intended for it to be. And that brings us into a place of being people of hope, people who have great wishes for this world. I know a few people who have wished for things like being taller, and that's great. There are people who have wished for silly things and people who have wished for great things. And I think God honors and captures those things in beautiful ways. And Elizabeth, thank you so much for being so thoughtful in how you're doing this project, to include people of every background and walk in this neighborhood, including our church. And so thank you for doing that. We have an opportunity, church, to not just make wishes, but to live in a way that brings reality to the wishes of this world. That when we move beyond the here and now and into a kingdom that'll last forever, we're called to live in a way that shows the world what it looks like for Christ to be king. And we live into a reality where wishes are made true as we usher in the kingdom and attend to what God is doing in this world. As we sing together, as we pray together, once you've written your wish on the slip of paper, and you need to do it with the felt pens that are provided because they'll all be scanned in, your wishes will actually be put in the mural in your handwriting. So if that scares you, yeah, it scares me too. But I will know it's mine because it won't be legible. But if you want to write your wishes down, be sure to do it with the felt pen because it will be scanned. But do that, and during our songs or after worship, if you would like to come up and leave this here, I wanted to collect the wishes here because the table is representative of the reality of which we live into when we look at the world and we wish for something better. This is where a better world has begun in Jesus Christ. So, church, as we prepare to break bread together, let's stand and let's sing. Nathan, come and lead us.